Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe, I'm your host for this week, and as always, I'm joined by my college friend Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Mark, as you know, today's topic is vaccine avoidance and the reasons for that. And I thought it would be a good idea for us to start by disclosing our own vaccination status, just to have that information out there at the very beginning. So I will start.
Okay.
I have received both Moderna vaccines and a Moderna booster. I've also had COVID twice. Once in March of 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic, which I experienced as a kind of mild to moderate flu for 4 or 5 days, but I did lose my senses of smell and taste for the better part of a year. And believe me, that was not fun. I got COVID a second time over the past Christmas holiday season, the end of 2021. And that time, after having been vaxxed and boosted, I experienced it as a 2 to 3 day intense head cold, nothing worse, no loss of smell or taste, which I personally attribute to the work of the vaccines, but
yeah, very possibly
whatever.
True.
Anyway, I was wondering if you could do the same.
Sure. So I am also double vaxxed, Pfizer in this case instead of Moderna, and I have been boosted again with Pfizer. And my system is COVID-free. I have not caught COVID. My wife is not. So even though Seattle was the original epicenter for the disease, I don't feel like we ever got to conditions like what New York is, just in terms of the number of vector points on the street that you could catch it. So we had much lower risk and were able to, at least so far, just evade the virus. Knock on wood.
Yeah. Okay, so as I told you at the end of the last episode, Mark, I have a close family member who is an anti-vaxxer, refusing to take the COVID vaccine. And I really want to understand where that anti-vax inclination comes from. So I asked you to research the anti-vax movement and then give me the best arguments for why somebody should not get vaccinated. And take those arguments seriously. So what did you find?
Well, thank you for that question, Joe. I will say that I was a little reluctant to research this question. I believe that ideas are very powerful things. And I admit I was a little concerned that in the process of dredging through the arguments against vaccination, I might be infected by one of those ideas and come away persuaded. I don't think that happened. I am happy to say that I remain firmly on the side of vaccination, but it was definitely an interesting experience trying to understand an argument and a point of view that's so different from my own. And this was also a challenging topic to research because I found that there's not a lot of high-quality material out there. That might seem crazy because, of course, YouTube and social media are infamously full of anti-vax content. And there are plenty of resources online that will tell you the many ways in which the anti-vax perspective is wrong. What's a lot more scarce, though, are sources that take the anti-vax perspective seriously, look into the sort of people who hold these beliefs, and think about what's behind it all.
Right.
In short, this is an area in which opinion is plentiful, but analysis is scarce.
Not surprising.
No. But before we get into it, there are a couple of things I should make clear from the top of this episode. First, although you mentioned COVID-19 in your original question, I understood you to be asking about the perspective of people who are anti-vaccine in general, rather than specifically opposed to the COVID-19 vaccine. In the latter case, there are a lot of political issues at play. Republicans in general are significantly less likely to get vaccinated than Democrats, for instance, and I will not be spending much time on that aspect of the situation. Likewise, I will not be considering anti-vaccine conspiracy theories. For instance, allegations that Bill Gates intentionally created the pandemic so that he could use it as a pretense for injecting microchips into our bloodstreams, or that the virus was scientifically engineered as a way to control world population. Instead of considering that crazy periphery, we're going to be looking today at more mainstream anti-vaccine sentiment and considering why, in the right situation, That point of view is understandable and maybe even reasonable.
Okay, good.
Researchers have identified 7 core anti-vaccine beliefs once you subtract the conspiracy theories. If I were to combine those 7 beliefs into a single statement, it would go like this. Quote, vaccines are created without adequate testing by profit-motivated pharmaceutical companies, and they contain a variety of toxic ingredients that can harm a child's immune system and create side effects that are worse than the original disease, such as allergies, autism, or in some cases even cancer. Previous generations suffered from pandemics, but today we are protected against disease by our improved diet, hygiene, and sanitation. The government should be protecting us, but instead politicians are in Big Pharma's pocket, and so the dangers posed by various diseases are exaggerated, and, solely for the benefit of the pharmaceutical industry, we are required to have unnatural chemicals injected into our bodies instead of relying on our body's own immune system, which provides protection that is superior to the artificial immunity produced by a vaccine. Unquote.
Okay, so you said a lot there, Mark, but let me try to tease out some of these strands. I did hear you say that if you're healthy, your immune system should be able to defend against it, because, of course, that's one of the arguments against taking the COVID vaccine.
Correct.
Also, I think you mentioned something about the haste with which vaccines were introduced. In the case of COVID, they were introduced via an emergency use authorization before full FDA approval, and I know that's one of the things that got in the craw of the anti-vaxxers.
Right, on the theme of inadequate testing.
Yes,
correct.
Exactly, yeah. And then there's the evolving science, for want of a better phrase, the fact that there's seems to be no consensus on the part of public health professionals at any stage of this virus's course. That kind of creates a moving the goalpost feeling on behalf of a lot of people. And I think that's unsettling to people. I think people want certainty when it comes to something that's being injected inside them multiple times.
Right.
So there's that. And then there's one particular thing that my family member has mentioned, and you tell me whether this goes off in the realm of conspiracy theories or not, but it's gene therapy, I think, with the mRNA vaccines, that they're changing your genetic code at the cellular level.
Yeah. It's not one of the top 7 beliefs, but that is there. It's verging on conspiracy theory. It's kind of in the gray area between valid concern and getting a little bit out there. And it is because the mRNA, the way that the mRNA vaccines operate on a cellular level, the perception is that these vaccines are rewriting your genetic code.
Right.
Of course, that's not how the vaccine works, but again, it's something that people find disquieting. It raises questions in people's minds. It gives them a sense of disquiet. Because I think that is important to understanding what is lying behind a lot of these viewpoints, which is that it comes down to one thing, a lack of trust. In the anti-vaccine narrative, there are 3 primary actors: the pharmaceutical industry, the government, and your doctor. Starting at the top, nobody trusts Big Pharma. According to one study by Deloitte, only 5% of Americans trust the pharmaceutical industry as a source of information for health conditions and treatments. And why would we? High prices for medicines are a leading driver of distrust, and the opioid epidemic is just the most recent version of a recurring story in which pharmaceutical companies promote the use of medication not because there's a pressing need for it, but because it's good for their own bottom line. In the U.S., vaccine production and distribution have increasingly been transitioning from the public to the private sphere, which only makes it easier to believe the vaccine skeptics' claim that repeated immunization protocols are excessive, redundant, and designed more with profit in mind than positive health outcomes. So vaccine skeptics don't trust Big Pharma, and I have to say I'm with them on that point. I don't trust Big Pharma either.
Nor do I, for the record.
Then there's the question of trust in government. The percentage of Americans who trust the federal government reached an all-time low of 17% during the Trump administration. It's recovered somewhat since then, but is still very low. Back in the late 1960s, 77% of Americans trusted their government, but that figure is at 24% today, and only 9% among Republicans, which is not the all-time low, That record was in 2010 when only 7% of Republicans said that they trusted the Obama administration.
Wow. I thought you were going to say it was at its lowest during Watergate, but it's during Obama's administration. Jesus.
Yeah. We all know how much sway industry lobbyists can have on our government. And as it happens, more than 2/3 of Congress cashed a check from the pharmaceutical industry in 2020. Those contributions together adding up to almost $90 million in a single year.
I just want to say that with the Vladimir Putin war in Ukraine raging as we tape this episode, it occurs to me that American anti-vaxxers seem to view our government the way that you and I would view Vladimir Putin's government. You know, suppressing truth at every turn, censoring speech, not allowing for dissent. That seems to be the way that a lot of Americans view their own government today.
Yeah, I think that's entirely true. And imagine living day to day within that belief that you are operating within basically the Putin version of America.
Yes.
And finally, there's the question of how much you trust the medical establishment in general and your own doctor and nurse in particular. In this case, distrust is more powerful than trust. Studies have shown that distrust of conventional medicine is more strongly correlated with the vaccine hesitancy than trust in alternative or natural health remedies. Overall, the medical establishment doesn't get high marks. Surveys indicate that even doctors don't really trust their higher-ups. But 2/3 of Americans do have a trusting relationship with their own doctor. Even so, that means 1/3 of Americans do not, which is a lot of people. Within minority communities in particular, there is ample reason to distrust doctors, given the structural racism they experience on a regular basis, not to mention historical atrocities such as the Tuskegee experiment, in which nearly 400 poor black men with syphilis were left untreated in order to study the effects of the disease on their minds and bodies.
Right.
According to one survey, trust in your doctor is highest among older people. 90% of those 60 and above, and 84% among people between the ages of 45 and 59. Trust in doctors declines from there as patients get younger. 74% of people aged 30 to 44, and only 59% of people aged 18 to 19 said that they trust their physician. When patients were asked in that same study why they don't trust their doctor, the leading responses were, their physician spends too little time with them, does not know them, does not listen to them, and does not provide them with sufficient information. 3% of respondents said they have a lack of trust because their doctor won't make eye contact with them, and I agree, that is pretty creepy.
Yeah.
Putting these factors together, the takeaway is that doctors and nurses who can't or won't spend the time to build relationships with their patients are engines of distrust. The next time those health providers say some version of trust me, they may not get the result they're hoping for.
Right. All three of those things that people distrust make sense to me. I'm just surprised and curious why you didn't also mention the media. It seems, to me at least, like distrust of the media is one of these same kind of pillars, that the media suppresses all bad news. So any adverse consequences of vaccines is suppressed by the media. You know, when the vaccine's actually worse than the virus, but you'd never know that from hearing talking heads on the media.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that rises to the level of joining this list of three you created?
It could be. I think my own personal sense is that you trust or distrust the media based on confirmation bias. Like you distrust MSNBC if they're saying that COVID is an emergency, if you already believe that COVID is a Democratic hoax. And you trust Fox News in saying that COVID is no big deal if that's already what you believe in, but you think that they're lying for political gain if you believe that COVID is an actual emergency.
Right.
So it's kind of like, where do you start from that perspective?
Yes.
And then that kind of defines how you respond to the media.
Yeah, okay, I got it. Let me say one other thing before you go on, though. How did the distrust of the establishment get this bad in the first place? You know, It seems like we've mainstreamed distrust with a capital D of all the institutions of our society.
Right.
And how the hell did this happen?
And there's something that an agency called Edelman works on every year, which is that they send out trust surveys to people to find out what they trust. And progressively over time, people are placing less trust in institutions. And they focus on businesses because they're a business consultancy. So people don't trust brands. They don't trust marketing messages. They don't trust executives. The only things that people consistently trust are people who remind them of themselves. Like if you can see yourself in someone else, you trust what that person has to say. And basically, it seems like the engine of that is that people have been lied to so many times. Like the reason we don't trust marketing is because we have a lifetime's experience of marketing being an absurd patchwork of lies about the product that's being pushed.
Right.
And we don't trust executives because we all have recent memory of an executive making a baldly false statement in support of either himself or the company that he represents. And so we are suspicious of people who have a financial or institutional reason to present falsehood as if it were truth, and place our trust in people who don't seem to be so motivated. And so I think the reason why trust in government is lower now than it was during the period of Watergate is because Watergate is one of the things that made us not trust government. Mm. And like as a Democrat, you suffered through the Reagan administration and then the Bushes, right. and increasingly you started to think those guys are liars. And if you're a Republican, you felt the same about Clinton and then about Obama. And that just this belief that you're being repeatedly lied to makes you disengage with the institution as a whole, rather than feel like it can be reformed, which I think ultimately fed into the whole Trump campaign of the best solution to the government is just to burn it to the ground.
That's really interesting. So much like the Tuskegee experiment was this traumatic threshold event that maybe contributed to a dwindling downward spiral of trust on behalf of people of color toward the medical establishment. You're postulating that Watergate was the traumatic threshold incident that started a downward spiral of trust in government and in institutions of society. That's interesting, and I think that's plausible.
Mm-hmm. So think about it. If Big Pharma creates a vaccine, the government prescribes it, and a doctor or nurse administers it, at which point in that chain of transmission are you going to find something or someone that you can trust? There are a lot of people who distrust all three of those actors, and there may be a majority of us who distrust two of the three. In the absence of trust, people question what they hear. 60% of Americans surveyed believe or don't know whether it's true or not that the government is exaggerating the number of COVID deaths. 49% believe or are unsure that pregnant women should not get the vaccine, and 35% believe or are unsure that deaths caused by the vaccine are being hidden by the government. In the absence of trust, you have a lot of people doing their own research. They're weighing the risk of not getting themselves or their children vaccinated. One 36-year-old man in Texas was quoted as saying about the COVID vaccine, quote, "The chances of me dying from a car accident are higher than my dying of COVID, but it's not like I don't get in my car," unquote. They're going online to figure out whether the vaccine might contain harmful ingredients that their doctors aren't talking about or might have potentially dangerous side effects. If they happen to do that research on YouTube or Facebook, they'll find a lot of misinformation that plugs directly into their concerns and magnifies them. Online, you can find a wealth of anecdotal stories about bad things that happened after someone got a vaccine. And as any fundraiser, journalist, or writer can tell you, a single story about a child with autism is much more vivid, powerful, and relatable than big numbers or statistical arguments.
Sure, yep.
Social media also generates pocket communities that advance a single consistent message, rather than articulating competing points of view, which can provide a false sense of consensus around fringe beliefs. And that's when confirmation bias takes hold. Once your skepticism has been reinforced, anyone arguing a contrary position becomes an object of suspicion. You question their credentials, their integrity, and the quality of the information they're drawing on. Now, if you're coming from the pro-vaccination camp, it's all too easy to assume that anti-vaxxers must be poor, uneducated, and unsophisticated.
Aren't they?
That is not the case. Globally, 80% of the world population agree that vaccines are safe. It's in the higher GDP countries where there's the lowest confidence in vaccines. Statistically speaking, people with vaccine-hesitant thoughts and behaviors are more likely to be educated, older, have higher social economic status, and be parents. And not everyone with these sentiments has the same goal. Some want to avoid all vaccines, while others want to avoid specific vaccines or reduce and delay the overall number of vaccinations.
Yeah, and that makes me think of the vaccines cause autism brouhaha that raged in the United States for years.
Right.
And maybe that was another kind of harbinger of where we're at now with COVID, right?
Right, which is based on something which is either a correlation or a coincidence, that the time that a certain vaccine is prescribed for a child is at 12 months of age, which is also the time at which autism symptoms manifest in children.
Right.
So to the anti-vaccine camp, that's a causal connection. To everyone else, that's an unfortunate coincidence. So when we think of a vaccine skeptic, we should imagine someone with certain doubts and uncertainties who is educated, has the capacity for critical thinking, and is interested in discussing the subject with their physician. And what sort of reception do they get when they try to do so? Considering how polarized we are on this issue, and how likely we are to assume the worst of the other side, these vaccine skeptics are probably not going to be received very well. There's a good chance that their concerns will be dismissed out of hand or even openly mocked, which will simply exacerbate their alienation and lack of trust. So what can we do about that? There's probably not a lot that you and I or the people listening to this podcast can do about vaccination rates. That will depend on doctors and policymakers doing a better job of making the case for vaccines. What applies to those conversations, though, also applies to conversations we might have with people in our lives who are vaccine hesitant. This involves speaking across ideological divides where emotions tend to run high. It's a challenging task, but it can be done with the right approach. The first step has to be building trust, and that's not something you can do overnight. Trust is a relationship. It is built over time by showing in ways both big and small that you're invested in the relationship and honestly care about the other person and respect their point of view, even if you don't happen to agree with it. That can be difficult when it feels like your conversation partner is spouting dangerous nonsense, but if we jump to judgment before we've laid the groundwork for a real conversation, that would do more harm than good. Second, fear is real, whether or not we agree that the fear is justified. Trying to talk someone out of being afraid rarely works. Instead, we need to engage with that feeling and have empathy for it. Approach your conversation with curiosity. Ask about what the other person is feeling and try to understand where that is coming from. Do the work to understand them rather than dismissing what they have to say. And third, set the debate over factual evidence of what's true or not true to the side for the moment and appeal to shared values instead. We may never agree on whether vaccine testing protocols are adequate, but we might agree that people deserve to feel safe and that as members of a community, we share a responsibility for the safety of the people around us. For bonus points, share a personal anecdote or two that communicates how you feel. The numbers may be on your side, but numbers don't feel human. Sharing a human story will give your conversation partner something to connect with. When I was looking for guidelines on navigating this sort of topic, I came across an article written by Nat Kendall-Taylor, which is linked in the sources for this episode, that I think really captures what is needed to make progress here. The article is about critical race theory, but the principles apply to the vaccine debate as well, and the following section is key. Quote, "When leaders discount such sentiments and write them off as fringe or folly, they make a grave mistake. Progressive leaders and communicators would do better to understand them and engage them. Understanding does not mean condoning, but if communicators continue to respond to opposing views with willful silence or acerbic rebuke, they cede ground, miss opportunities to connect, and make themselves increasingly irrelevant." Unquote. So what do you think, Joe? Have we taken a step toward greater understanding today?
I do, and I really like what you said at the end, and I don't disagree with any of it. There are two things I think I want to say in reaction to your last section. One is that one of the dangers, as you were talking about understanding the fear, fear is real. Don't dismiss it. Don't ridicule it. Try to understand it. As you were saying those words, I was thinking of the way you deal with a child who's fearful, who thinks there's a monster in the closet, right? And it strikes me as true as what you said is, it strikes me also as a little bit paternalistic to have that attitude, like we know better. We know the truth, right? We, the pro-vax community, knows the truth. And you're the scared little child that thinks the monster of the vaccine is in the closet. So we're going to understand and listen to you. You know what I mean? Like, rightly or wrongly, that did occur to me, and that might help, that might reinforce some of the alienation. It's like a delicate ballet to understand the fear. What do you say, that doesn't further alienate your interlocutor in that situation? What do you think?
I think for me, what helps is to understand that in this sort of conversation, there isn't one truth. There's two truths. There's the truth that I hold, and there's the truth that the other person holds. So it's kind of drawing a distinction between truths and facts, in that truth is something that you hold to be true, whereas facts are ideally objective and verifiable. And so it's approaching that conversation where truth is not the topic of the conversation, but it's about how do you feel about this? Where do those feelings come from? And really trying to get in that person's mind and understand where they're coming from and connecting on that feeling, because we can all relate to being afraid. We can all relate to being uncertain. I can certainly relate to a parent who is sincerely worried about what the health effects of a medical procedure might be on their child. Like, that parent has a very serious decision to make in terms of do it or don't do it, or ask for it to be delayed, with possibly profound implications for whichever decision is made. I can relate to that. I may not agree with their standpoint on certain things, but I can relate to the feeling. And if I can find a place where I understand what they're feeling, then that's a much better groundwork for maybe later having the conversation about what the facts are, once they understand that I'm not just coming in to say, oh, yeah, you're full of shit, and I'm here to clear this up because I know better than you.
Right. Yeah, I like that answer, and I like the distinction you're drawing between alternative feelings, which can be expressed as alternative truths, right? Those exist, but alternative facts do not exist, contra Kellyanne Conway, right? Yeah.
Right.
But here's the second thing I wanted to say, and this is just my personal feeling, but I want it out there since we're talking about vaccines. For me, the decision to take a vaccine is also a civics, a citizenship issue. It ain't all about freedom, folks. Not getting vaccinated, to me, is like smoking in a public place. You risk the health of your fellow citizens by doing that thoughtless thing. So we don't smoke in public places anymore. And we get vaccinated. And we do both of those things to fulfill our duties to each other as citizens. And that's why I support vaccination mandates, where we force people to be vaccinated in order to work at their jobs or get admitted to certain venues, because we're all citizens. We all have to live together. And, what do you think of that?
As a professional communicator, I saw the unfolding of the communications around COVID with what I can only describe as horror, because what we were hearing from the CDC and the WHO and doctors who had podcasts and people who were appearing on television was just this cacophony. And it was very poorly formulated.
Yes.
And I think one of the critical errors looking back on it now is that the original messaging around masks was all about whether or not the mask would protect you individually from the virus. And if you recall, the initial argument was, no, don't bother with the mask because the virus is way too small. It can easily pass through the particles in your mask. And it wasn't until about 6 months into the pandemic that the message came out with like, oh, yeah, actually, you should wear masks because when you cough and sneeze, that reduces particle spread and you're less likely to infect someone else. And if you had flipped those, I think that there was an opportunity there to present the message as we wear masks for other people and not for ourselves. And we do this as members of a community. And we do that for the same reason that when we're driving down the freeway, we don't suddenly choose to drive in the oncoming lane because we own a responsibility to keep each other safe. And instead, it was around, like taking care of yourself. And then so the battle lines became hardened over whether or not you should be able to make that choice for yourself instead of the choices that we're all required just by ethics, if not by law, to make for each other. And so, unfortunately, the way that communications were organized, it was an institutional breakdown on the part of the medical establishment. And it was also, I think, an outcome of the fact that in today's age with podcasts and whatnot, pretty much anyone can set themselves up as an authority on the topic. And we are still to this day seeing repercussions of the fact that the messaging was just poorly organized and focused on the wrong things.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And that bungling of the masking issue, I believe, led to one of the first of the conspiracy theories that later blossomed with COVID, and that was that the government was secretly hoarding all the masks to give them to first responders and medical providers, and that's why we the public were being told not to wear masks, because there was a limited supply. And whether that's true or not, it certainly was a bungled response that led to the flowering of all these crazy theories. So you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah. So did I answer your question? Did I help you to better understand the perspective of people who are at least vaccine hesitant, if not outright vaccine hostile?
Yes, you did. And I appreciate that perspective. And I'm going to think a lot about this going forward because I want to have a productive, healthy, loving relationship with this family member. And,
Sure.
I don't want this to be a cause of severe rupture, and it might be a cause. So empathy and understanding is certainly a way to address that kind of rupture. So I appreciate it, Mark.
Okay. So are you ready for your question for next time?
I am, yes.
Okay. So a couple episodes ago, we touched on homelessness. And there are two schools of thought on how people like you and me can help out the homeless. The first is to give them money, and the second is to not give them money, since they might spend that on drugs or alcohol. Instead, we should give the money to an organization that feeds and benefits the homeless and tries to get them off the street. This is a local version of a bigger contention. One side arguing that charitable contributions should go to organizations that fight poverty and work to eradicate disease, while others argue that we should just give the money to poor people and let them decide what to do with it. So I'd like you to look into this question, Joe, and come back with a point of view. Who should our money go to? The guy on the street corner or the charity that is dedicated to getting him off the street? And while it might be tempting to say both, I'm going to ask you to choose one of the two.
Okay, Mark, you realize that I work for a 501c3 charitable organization, right?
Yes, so you possibly have a vested interest here, but I trust you to take an open mind to this question.
And if I come in on the side of donating to individuals, I may need to change my name and disguise my voice for our next taping.
Yes.
So be prepared.
Or we can tell people which street corner you're on so they can come by to contribute to your cause.
Yeah. All right, good question. I'll look forward to getting into that. So, folks, mansplaining audience, if you have any thoughts about this episode or would like to comment on this or any other episode of our podcast, please go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast. That's where you can like us, check our sources, leave a comment or a question about what you just heard, or suggest topics for future episodes. We welcome and appreciate any and all feedback that you might want to share with us. If you're so inclined, you can also give us a rating or write a review on whatever app you use to listen to this podcast. And let me just say, Mom, I'm counting on you to do that. And the check is in the mail. But that's it for now. That was Mark, and I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you then. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.